Good morning. My name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Thursday. It's February 13th. Today, I don't know what today is. Today is February 13th. Let me tell you, today is day 496. So February 13th, day 496. The most significant news this past week is how dangerously close the Israeli Hamas ceasefire came to completely falling apart. So the ceasefire agreement came into effect on January 19th. It has been hanging by a thread from the very beginning, but on Sunday of last week, President Trump said on Air Force One that he was committed to U.S. ownership of Gaza. He told a group of reporters that the U.S. would buy and own the Gaza Strip, and that they would possibly give sections of it to other states, meaning foreign states who could help to rebuild it, investing in it financially and the like. And then President Trump this past Monday said that the ceasefire deal should be canceled and that all hell would break out if all of the hostages were not released from Gaza by noon this coming Saturday. On Monday, President Trump said that Palestinians would not have the right to return to Gaza under his proposal to take over the enclave. So as a part of the U.S. taking over the Gaza Strip, the entire population of the Gaza Strip would be relocated. He kept using numbers that were not the entire population of the Strip. He kept saying, 1.8, 1.9. The entire population is more than 2 million, 2.1 to 2.3 is the actual population of the Strip. And Trump was saying that the population had to be relocated to Jordan and to Egypt and possibly to other Arab states. After relocation, Palestinians would not have the right to return under the Trump proposal. He shared this in an interview with Fox News. A part of the interview was shared before the Super Bowl this past Sunday. The rest of the interview was shared on Monday. When asked whether or not the Palestinians would be allowed to return, he very clearly said no, that they would be displaced and they would not be allowed to return. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu followed suit and said in an address that Israel would end the ceasefire agreement, that the Israeli state would gather forces both inside and around the Gaza Strip in preparation to resume the war if all of the hostages held by Hamas were also not returned by Saturday. There was a lot of confusion about what that meant, about if that meant the 3 hostages that were supposed to be returned on Saturday. There were conflicting statements. And then Netanyahu clarified that he meant 9 hostages, which there were more than 9 hostages. So this week was incredibly chaotic in terms of the news. After all of this happened, the finance minister in Israel, Smotrich, called on Netanyahu to inform Hamas unequivocally that either all of the hostages be released by Saturday or that the gates of hell be opened upon them, meaning no electricity, no water, no fuel, no humanitarian aid. This is a direct quote. Complete occupation and an expulsion of all Gazans from the Gaza Strip. Now, this should sound very, very, very familiar because this is the exact language that was used in the days following the October 7th attacks in 2023. The IDF announced that the mobilization of reservists amid the reinforcement of troops around Gaza and an increased alert level in South Israel. So in the past few days, many of us have been despondent, thinking that there was really no alternative and that the bombing of Gaza was going to resume really any day now. With Trump's statements last week about the U.S. taking over Gaza, Egypt responded saying that if there was increased pressure for the Palestinian population from the Strip, if that pressure continued, that the very peace treaty between Egypt and Israel would be at risk. There was a question, of course, about the peace treaty between Jordan and Israel as well. Trump had suggested, this was prior to the meeting between King Abdullah and President Trump that happened this week. Trump had suggested that the U.S. aid that goes to Jordan, which is about $1.5 billion every year. Trump had suggested that that could be used as leverage to force Jordan to take the Palestinian population. Analysts agreed that if refugees from Gaza flooded Jordan, it would not only put immeasurable pressure on the country, meaning Jordan, it would not only put pressure on Jordan's economy, but that it would also destabilize the nation. Of course, you probably know that the Jordanian population is roughly, if not more than 60% Palestinian. King Abdullah would risk also abundant resistance from within the country if he did, in fact, receive Palestinian refugees from Gaza. But here's the good news. This morning, I found this out last night before I went to bed. I'm currently in Denver. This was about 1 o'clock in Israel, 1 o'clock in the morning. In the first hours of Thursday morning, February 13th, Israeli officials reportedly sent a message to Hamas through mediators in Egypt and Qatar that the hostages release is to move forward. And so it looks like the ceasefire deal is set to move forward. And so there has been a lot of effort from Egypt. There has been effort from Steve Witkoff, who is the senior advisor for the Trump administration, to try to get things back on track. So we're hearing from Israel, at least the news is reporting, we hope, we pray that the crisis in the immediate has been averted. According to the Times of Israel, the efforts from Qatar and Egypt, as well as I mentioned, the U.S. Special Envoy Witkoff, have resolved the immediate issues. In terms of some other, big picture news, we know that Israeli forces have killed at least 92 Palestinians and wounded more than 800 since the Gaza ceasefire took hold. Egypt plans to offer, quote, comprehensive proposals to rebuild Gaza while Palestinians remain in their land. This is, again, big picture. On Sunday, February 9th, Israel completed, this is a very, very big deal. The Israeli military is no longer present in the Netzarim corridor. And so the Israeli military has withdrawn from the militarized zone that bisects Gaza in accordance with the ceasefire agreement. So that happened this past week. Egyptian and Qatari mediators have been working. The other issue with the ceasefire deal, which was kind of secondary to all of this drama between Trump and Netanyahu, is that Hamas said that they were withdrawing from the ceasefire deal because Israel had violated its agreements because it was not meeting the basic needs that were agreed to because of the humanitarian assistance that was promised, not meeting the basic number of trucks that was agreed to in terms of the aid that was promised to the Gaza Strip. It was not meeting the agreed upon number of tents, shelters, and other vital aid that was supposed to be allowed to enter into the territory. So good news came in that regard also, where Egypt negotiated, and some of those issues that were threatening the ceasefire agreement had been resolved yesterday on Wednesday. I will say I had not been hearing anything about Steve Witkoff. Steve Witkoff was a key critical player in helping to negotiate the basic fundamental components of this three-part deal. He's the senior advisor for the Trump administration. There's been a lot of silence about him in the news, at least as it relates to the Middle East. And I began to wonder, did he fall out of favor with President Trump? What happened? So I was doing some news searches, and it ends up he was the one who brought Mark Fogel, who was the American who spent 3 years in Russian prison. He was the one who went and picked him up from Russia. I just was speaking to someone who works closely with the Trump administration on a phone call, which was why I was late for this call. And he said, I was wondering why is the Middle East envoy going to Russia? And what I heard was, he has a private plane and is very trusted by President Trump. And it might be less that he was a part of those negotiations and more that he's just a very senior official who's trusted by the president. So it's believed that Trump and Putin negotiated that, but the Middle East envoy Witkoff is very trusted and thus was pulled off the Middle East desk for a bit to help bring Mr. Fogel home. Now, Witkoff, of course, was in the news. He said, no American gets left behind. That was a message of hope to every American who's being held in a foreign jail. He's been interviewed quite extensively as he brought Mr. Fogel home. What's going on in terms of humanitarian assistance in Gaza? The Trump administration's efforts to sideline U.S. aid have endangered the Gaza aid supply chain and is risking destabilizing the ceasefire, U.S. officials and humanitarian group workers have said. As was evidenced, that was the reason that Hamas gave for pulling out of the ceasefire before Egypt intervened. And again, good news was reported yesterday, not only because of Egypt's intervention, but OSHA, the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, reported that yesterday 801 trucks entered into Gaza. UN reported that 1.2 million people have been fed. Shelter has been provided to more than 600,000 people. Water and waste disposal services have been provided to nearly 500,000 people. And 37 shelters for Palestinians returning to the war-battered north have been provided with tents, blankets, and warm clothing. 644,000 people across the territory have received tents, tarps, or sealing off materials to improve their shelter conditions. The Gaza Health Ministry said yesterday on Wednesday that 1 Palestinian died and 9 were injured. There was an incident in Rafah, and the IDF also confirmed the attack. As we talked about what happened over the weekend, Hamas on Saturday did release 3 Israeli hostages. So that was the latest in the hostage prisoner exchange. 183 Palestinian detainees were released. Netanyahu said that the hostages appeared gaunt and their appearance was shocking. Several of the Palestinian prisoners also had to be taken to hospitals with evidence of torture in Israeli prisons. Some hostages that were freed by Hamas have been tortured while in captivity, family members also said, also citing intelligence from Israeli military reports. As of Friday, February 7th, Israel's war on Gaza confirmed a death toll of at least 47,583 people, with those injured at more than 112,000. But the official death toll has been raised to 61,709 people because of the number of people who are missing under the rubble and are now presumed dead. And those killed in Israel during the October 7th attacks still remains around 1,200 people, with those being taken captive between 240 and 250 people. There was a groundbreaking report investigation that was released by 972 and the local call reporter that was released Thursday a week ago. It was based on conversations with 15 military sources. This report revealed that the Israeli Army intensively bombarded residential areas in Gaza when there was insufficient intelligence on the exact location of Hamas commanders that were hiding underground. And the Israeli military intentionally weaponized toxic byproducts of bunker buster bombs in order to suffocate militants in their tunnels. When targeting senior commanders in the groups, the Israeli military authorized the killing of triple-digit numbers of Palestinian civilians as collateral damage and maintained close real-time coordination with U.S. officials regarding the expected casualty figures. Some of these strikes, which were the deadliest in the war, often used American bombs and were known to have killed Israeli hostages, despite concerns raised ahead of time by military officers. Hamas said it may not have been able to hand over the remains of some of the Israeli captives because more than 12,000 bodies remain under the rubble, and heavy equipment is prevented from entering into the enclave. Also, late last week, Netanyahu told U.S. lawmakers that he wants to extend the first phase of the ceasefire deal. Of course, you're familiar that the second phase of the ceasefire is where the most difficult negotiations are set to take place. In the West Bank, There have been increased incursions by the Israeli military. I just learned that 80% of the refugee camp in Jenin has been displaced. Numerous buildings have been completely destroyed, including family residences. The Tulkarm refugee camp, 25% of the camp has been destroyed and families displaced. We've been asked, where are those families going? And they're relocating to other cities, to extended family members or friends. The Israeli Defense Forces have been blowing up homes and buildings in those refugee camps in those cities. In the occupied Palestinian territories yesterday, there were gunfire and explosions as Israeli forces pushed ahead in the north of the occupied West Bank. Soldiers and armored vehicles remained deployed in the urban refugee camps of Ner Shams. Residents are stuck in their homes without running water. This is the fourth day of the raid in Ner Shams, as military bulldozers tore up roads and gunfire blasts in the alleys. Troops fired sound bombs, explosions shook houses. The Israeli military called out in Arabic over a mosque loudspeaker in this camp of Ner Shams that has 7,000 residents, calling on the people to evacuate. Hundreds of people fled the camp outside of the city of Tulkarm on Wednesday. The mayors of the nearby villages scrambled and reported on these incidents. One Palestinian was killed and an Israeli soldier was injured. Also, this week on Tuesday, 11 buildings in Masafer Yatta in the South Hebron Hills were demolished. This was the largest demolition in 2 years. In the US, King Abdullah and President Trump met at the White House on Tuesday. Trump doubled down on the demand that Gazans be displaced and that the US is going to take control of Gaza. Following the meeting, Abdullah said that he reiterated Jordan's steadfast position against the displacement of Palestinians, while King Abdullah pushed back on Trump's plans for Jordan to absorb Gazan immigrants. He did offer to take 2,000 sick children from Gaza. And President Trump said of the situation in Gaza after this meeting that, quote, "I think it's going to work out," end quote. The State Department on Friday notified Congress that it intends to move forward with an $8 billion weapon sale to Israel. This is bypassing an informal review that was underway in a House committee. I just want to note this is at the same time that so much US aid funding and other foreign assistance funding is either on hold or completely cut. In Palestine yesterday, or earlier this week, President Abbas revoked the system of payments to families of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails or families of Palestinians who were killed or wounded during attacks against Israelis. The system has been called by the Trump administration or others the Pay for Slay program. This was a major point of friction between the US and the Palestinian Authority. But the Israeli foreign minister issued a statement on Monday denying that the payments would actually end and said it was a fraudulent trick by the Palestinian Authority. We also heard, this was also late last night on Wednesday, that Israel is likely to strike Iran in coming months. US intelligence warns it would be a preemptive attack that would set back Iran's nuclear program by mere weeks or months. This would, if it happens, significantly escalate tensions across the Middle East. This was based on a US intelligence report that warns Israel is likely to attempt a strike on specifically the Fordo and Natanz nuclear facilities. It's expected in the first 6 months of 2025. The Washington Post issued an analysis of Israel's plans following its bombing of Iran in late October, which degraded its air defenses and left Tehran exposed to a follow-up assault. Also, in terms of the Hezbollah-Israel ceasefire agreement, that is hanging on a precipice as well. On Wednesday in Beirut, the new Lebanese president, Joseph Aoun, said that Israel must withdraw all of its forces in the next week's deadline. The president of Lebanon denied rumors that there was another extension. The deadline was extended to February 18th. And President Aoun said that must be honored. There was false news reports that the deadline had been pushed to the 28th. Israeli warplanes broke the sound barrier this week in a low altitude over Beirut and other areas on Wednesday. This was the first incident since the ceasefire. On Wednesday, a Saudi news outlet reported that Lebanon agreed to postpone the IDF's withdrawal until after Eid al-Fitr, which ends on April 2nd, but the Lebanese president denied the claim. An Israeli report said that the U.S. had authorized the IDF to maintain a long-term IDF presence in South Lebanon. The Lebanese also formed a new government on Saturday following following weeks of talks, the new prime minister announced. In Yemen, the Houthis are ready to attack Israel again if fighting in Gaza remains. And a UN World Food Program staffer died while detained by Houthi rebels in Yemen. And the UN announced it's suspending all humanitarian operations in Houthi-controlled areas in Yemen over arbitrary detention incidents. I had a couple of updates on Syria. I wanted to see what are the most significant. Syria will allow Russia to retain its air and naval bases as long as any agreement with the Kremlin serves Damascus' interests. The future of Syria's Al-Hol camp, which is holding thousands of members of the Islamic State, is in doubt because of all the funding issues. And the Trump administration's U-turns and the uncertain aid freezes. So there are significant concerns about that. The broader Middle East, a Swedish court yesterday sentenced a woman to 12 years in prison for committing genocide and war crimes against the Yazidi people on behalf of the Islamic State in Syria. I wanted to close with the Israeli police said it arrested 2 people over selling books that contain incitement and support for terrorism during a raid this weekend on Palestinian bookstores. Some of my favorite places to be, the Education Bookshop. They happen to sell one of my books. It made me think of an Oscar Wilde quote that says, "The books that the world calls immoral are the books that show the world its own shame." And Catholic Relief Services, which is one of our observer members, has been the greatest recipient of U.S. aid funding. They just announced yesterday they could be cutting as much as 50% of their staff in coming days. Catholic Relief Services has been one of the leading actors responding to humanitarian needs and the development crisis, and so many of the desperate needs in the Gaza Strip in the past months. Lord have mercy. Christ have mercy.